On the 5th of August, 1993, 6 young hikers walked into the mountains of southern Siberia and never walked out. Within minutes, something happened on that slope. Something so violent, so incomprehensible, that the one person who survived would spend the rest of her life trying to make anyone believe what she saw. They foamed at the mouth. They bled from their eyes. They clawed at their own throats as if the air itself had turned to poison. And then, one by one, they fell. This is a true story. The bodies were eventually found, bruised and broken on a grassy ridge above the tree line. The official report said hypothermia. But hypothermia doesn't make 6 healthy people collapse in synchronized agony. Hypothermia doesn't cause bleeding from the eyes and ears. And hypothermia certainly doesn't explain why the lone survivor, a 17-year-old girl, had to spend 4 days alone in the wilderness, stealing food from the pockets of her lifeless friends, just to make it out alive. The mountains of Khamar Daban keep their secrets well. Tonight we're going to try to uncover them. My name is Julian Cross, and this is the Midnight File. Every mountain range has a reputation. Some are known for their beauty, others for their challenge. The Khamar Daban Mountains, stretching south of Lake Baikal in the Russian Republic of Buryatia, are known for their treachery. It's a place where summer can become winter, in the span of an hour, where fog rolls in like a living thing, and where even experienced climbers have learned to respect the sudden violence of the weather. In early August of 1993, a group of 7 young people set out to cross a section of this range. They were members of the Azimut Hiking Club from Petropavl, a city in northern Kazakhstan, and they were led by one of the most respected outdoors instructors in the region, a woman named Lyudmila Korovina. Lyudmila was not someone who took chances. At 41 years old, she held the title of Master of Sports, a Soviet-era distinction reserved for athletes and adventurers who had proven themselves at the highest levels of their discipline. She had been leading expeditions for years, had trained dozens of young hikers, and knew the language of the wilderness the way a conductor knows a symphony. If anyone could guide a group safely through Khamar Daban, it was her. The 6 young people who followed her into those mountains trusted her completely. They were fit, they were eager, and they were prepared for a summer trek through one of Siberia's most stunning landscapes. None of them could have imagined what was waiting for them on that exposed ridge, 2,400 meters above sea level. The group assembled in the first days of August. Along with Lyudmila, there were 6 others. Alexander Krysin, a strong young man with a reputation for endurance. Denis Shvachkin, quiet and dependable. Timur Bapanov, always ready with a joke to lift spirits. Viktor Zalesova, steady and methodical. Tatyana Filipenko, spirited and curious. And finally, the youngest of them all, Valentina Utochenko, just 17 years old, on what was supposed to be an adventure she would remember fondly for the rest of her life. Instead, it became something she would never be able to forget. On the 2nd of August, they began their ascent. The weather was good. The trails, though demanding, were manageable. They moved through forests of pine and larch, crossing streams swollen with snowmelt, breathing in the sharp, clean air of high altitude. At night, they pitched their tents, cooked simple meals over portable stoves, and talked about the route ahead. Lyudmila reviewed the maps with them, pointing out landmarks and reminding them to stay hydrated, to pace themselves, to watch for signs of altitude sickness. Everything was by the book. Everything was as it should be. For 2 days, the trek unfolded exactly as planned, but the mountains are not kind to plans. By the evening of the 4th of August, the weather began to turn. What had been clear skies and mild temperatures gave way to something darker. Clouds gathered over the peaks, thick and low. The wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of rain and the promise of cold. Lyudmila, reading the signs, made a decision. Rather than descending back into the forest where they would have natural shelter, she chose to camp high, on an exposed saddle near the ridgeline. It was a calculated risk. The higher camp would allow them to cover more ground the next day, to stay on schedule for their planned rendezvous with another hiking party around the 5th. But it also left them vulnerable. Up there, above the tree line, there was no protection from the wind, no thick canopy of trees to break the force of the storm that was coming. Some have criticized that decision. Some have said it was the choice that sealed their fate. But Lyudmila Korovina was not careless. She had been in situations like this before. She knew how to read the mountains, how to weigh risk against reward. Whatever she saw in the weather that night, she believed they could handle it. And perhaps, if the storm had been the only thing they faced, she would have been right. They set up camp as the first drops of rain began to fall. The wind howled across the ridge, snapping at the fabric of the tents, making every movement a struggle. The temperature dropped sharply. What had been rain turned to sleet, then to something harder, more punishing. Inside the tents, huddled in their sleeping bags, the group tried to stay warm, tried to rest. Outside, the storm raged through the night, relentless and cold. By morning, they were soaked. Their clothing, their gear, everything was damp and heavy. But they were alive, they were together, and they were ready to move. The plan was to descend, to get off the exposed ridge and back into the relative safety of the lower slopes. It was the right call. It should have worked. At some point in the early hours of August 5th, they broke camp and began their descent. The details of those first minutes are hazy, filtered through the memory of a traumatized 17-year-old girl trying to make sense of the impossible. But what we know, what Valentina Utochenko has told investigators, journalists, and anyone who would listen, is this. They were walking in a line, moving carefully down the slope, when something went wrong. Alexander Krisin was at the back of the group. Valentina remembers hearing him shout, a sound of alarm that cut through the wind. She turned, along with the others, and saw him stumble. At first, she thought he had simply lost his footing on the wet ground. But then he fell to his knees and the shout became a scream. His body began to convulse. His hands went to his throat, clawing, tearing at his own skin as if something inside him was trying to get out. Foam poured from his mouth, thick and white, spilling down his chin. And then, according to Valentina, blood began to run from his eyes and ears. Lyudmila, ever the leader, ran back to help him. She dropped to her knees beside Alexander, trying to hold him steady, trying to understand what was happening. But before she could even assess the situation, she too began to collapse. Valentina watched as Lyudmila's face twisted in pain, as she cried out once, then fell forward onto Alexander's convulsing body. Within moments, both of them were still. Tatiana Filipenko, young and terrified, rushed toward them, but she didn't make it far. Halfway there, she stopped, her hands flying to her throat. She began to choke, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Her eyes went wide with panic, and then, in a moment that Valentina can never unsee, Tatiana began to beat her own head against the rocks. Again and again, with a force that defied reason, as if she were trying to destroy whatever was happening inside her skull. She fell, she didn't get up. The remaining three, Denis, Timur, and Victor, panicked. They ran, not toward their fallen friends, but away, downslope, toward the tree line, toward anywhere that might offer safety. Valentina watched them go, stumbling and falling, their movements uncoordinated, desperate. One by one, they collapsed. One by one, the mountain claimed them. And Valentina Utochenko, 17 years old and utterly alone, did the only thing she could do. She ran. If you're listening to this and you feel that cold hand of dread tightening around your chest, you're not alone. Stories like this, stories where the ordinary world tears open and reveals something inexplicable, are why we keep searching for answers. If you want more of these deep investigations into the cases that refuse to let go, subscribe to the Midnight File, because the next story might be the one that keeps you up at night. Valentina fled down the slope, away from the bodies of her friends, away from the incomprehensible horror that had just unfolded. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't have a plan. She just moved, driven by the primal need to survive. That first night, she found shelter beneath the low branches of a pine tree, curling into herself, shivering violently in her wet clothes. The storm continued. The cold seeped into her bones. She was alone in the wilderness, with no supplies, no clear sense of direction, and no way to call for help. The nearest settlement was days away on foot. The nearest road was little more than a rumor. All she had was the fading light, the sound of wind through the trees, and the memory of what she had just witnessed. By the second day, hunger forced her to make a choice. She couldn't go forward without food, without gear. and the only place to find those things was back where she had left them, on the bodies of her friends. It's difficult to imagine what that must have taken, what reserves of strength and desperation Valentina had to draw on to go back to that place. But she did. She returned to the slope, to the sprawled forms of the people she had been laughing with just hours before. She searched their pockets. She took what little food they had left. She found a compass, a bit of rope, a jacket. And then she left again, this time following a set of power lines she had spotted from higher up the ridge. Those lines, she reasoned, had to lead somewhere. They had to lead to people. For 4 more days, Valentina walked. She followed the power lines when she could see them, and when she couldn't, she followed the river. She drank from streams, she rationed the food she had taken. She slept under trees and in the gaps between boulders. She kept moving because stopping meant giving up, and giving up meant joining her friends in the cold silence of the mountains. On the 9th or 10th of August, the exact date is unclear, a group of Ukrainian kayakers navigating a river in the lower valleys spotted something unusual on the shore, a figure small and hunched, covered in dirt and dried blood. At first they weren't sure if it was human. When they approached, they found Valentina Utachenko, barely conscious, her eyes hollow with shock, her clothes torn and stained. She tried to speak. The words came out broken, fragmented. Something about her friends, something about the ridge, something about how they had all just stopped. The kayakers got her to safety, to the nearest village, and from there word began to spread. A girl had come out of the mountains alone. The rest of her group was still up there, somewhere. The authorities were notified. But here's where the story takes another dark turn, because no one moved quickly. No formal search was organized immediately. Days passed, then a week, then 2. It wasn't until the 24th of August, nearly 3 weeks after the incident, that a helicopter-supported search operation was finally launched into the Khamar Daban range to locate the missing hikers. On the 26th of August, the search team found them. All 6 bodies arranged in a rough cluster on the grassy slope just above the tree line, exactly where Valentina had said they would be. The scene was disturbing in its stillness. There were no signs of violence from an external source, no animal predation, no obvious trauma. Just 6 people who had stopped moving, stopped breathing, stopped being. The bodies were airlifted out. Autopsies were performed in Ulan-Ude, the capital of Buryatia. And then, after weeks of waiting, after all the questions and the fear and the desperate need for answers, the official report was released. Hypothermia. 5 of the hikers, Alexander, Tatiana, Denis, Timur, and Victor, had perished from exposure to cold. Lyudmila Korovina, the leader, had suffered a heart attack. The report noted evidence of pulmonary edema, fluid in the lungs, and bruising consistent with respiratory distress. It mentioned malnutrition, suggesting that the group had been underfed during the trek, which had weakened their resistance to the elements. And that was it. Case closed. Tragic accident. Human error. Move on. But the people who read that report, the people who knew these hikers, the people who had heard Valentina's account, they couldn't move on, because none of it made sense. Hypothermia is not a fast process. It doesn't strike 6 people simultaneously in the span of minutes. It creeps in slowly, over hours, sapping strength and coordination, inducing confusion and fatigue before the final collapse. The victims of hypothermia don't foam at the mouth. They don't bleed from their eyes and ears. They don't convulse violently or engage in self-destructive behavior like smashing their heads against rocks. Hypothermia makes you sleepy, makes you want to lie down and rest. It doesn't make you scream. And yet, that's what the official record claimed had happened on that ridge. The families of the lost hikers were outraged. Valentina herself rejected the findings. She told anyone who would listen that what had taken her friends was not the cold. It was something else, something sudden, something that attacked them from within, shutting down their lungs, their brains, their ability to function as human beings. And there was another detail, one that the official report glossed over, but that medical experts would later seize upon. Every single body showed signs of severe pulmonary damage, bruised lungs, edema. The kind of injury you might see in someone who had drowned or inhaled a toxic substance. Not the kind of injury you typically associate with freezing to passing. So what really happened on that mountain? Let's take a step back and look at the possibilities, because in the decades since 1993, researchers, journalists, and amateur investigators have proposed a range of theories, each trying to fit the pieces of this impossible puzzle together. The first and most obvious explanation is the one the authorities settled on: exposure and exhaustion. The logic goes like this. The group camped high in bad weather, got soaked, and by morning were already compromised. The cold wind, the altitude, the exertion of trying to descend in those conditions, all of it combined to push their bodies past the breaking point. Add in malnutrition, as the report suggested, and you have a recipe for disaster. One person collapses, panic sets in, and the stress accelerates the decline of the others. It's a domino effect, a cascade failure of human physiology under extreme duress. There's some merit to this. The Khamar Daban range is notorious for sudden weather shifts. What feels like summer at lower elevations can become winter-like near the peaks. The wind chill alone, especially when you're wet, can drop effective temperatures to near freezing even in August. And panic is a powerful force. It can make people do irrational things, burn through their energy reserves, cloud their judgment. But here's the problem. This explanation requires us to ignore or reinterpret the most dramatic elements of Valentina's testimony. The bleeding, the frothing, the speed of onset. Hypothermia doesn't present like that. It just doesn't. And while stress can exacerbate physical decline, it doesn't cause 6 people to simultaneously experience acute neurological and respiratory collapse in the span of minutes. So if it wasn't just the cold, what else could it have been? The second major theory is darker, more unsettling, and hinges on the word exposure in a very different sense: chemical exposure. Siberia has a long history as a testing ground for the Soviet military and industrial apparatus. Remote, sparsely populated, and conveniently far from prying eyes, it was the perfect place to conduct experiments that couldn't be done anywhere else. Nerve agents, biological weapons, industrial toxins. For decades, the Soviet Union developed and tested some of the most lethal substances ever created, and not all of those test sites were cleaned up or even properly documented. Could the Khamar Daban hikers have stumbled into a contaminated zone? It's not as far-fetched as it sounds. The symptoms Valentina described: sudden convulsions, respiratory distress, bleeding from mucous membranes, violent disorientation, are consistent with exposure to certain classes of nerve agents, particularly organophosphates. These are chemicals that disrupt the nervous system's ability to function, causing muscles to contract uncontrollably, airways to flood with fluid, and the brain to essentially short-circuit. In high doses, passing can come within minutes, and it doesn't take much. A lingering cloud of vapor, a patch of contaminated ground, a wind shift carrying particles from a nearby test site, any of these could, in theory, expose a group of hikers without them ever realizing what was happening. The pulmonary damage noted in the autopsies fits this scenario as well. Inhalation of toxic gases or aerosolized agents often causes severe lung injury, flooding the alveoli with fluid and leading to the kind of bruising and edema that the pathologists found. And here's the chilling part. If the substance involved was a classified military compound, the Soviet-era labs conducting the autopsies might not have had the equipment or the authorization to test for it. Even if they suspected something, even if they saw signs that didn't match a simple hypothermia diagnosis, they would have been under enormous pressure to keep it quiet. The 1990s were a chaotic time in Russia. The Soviet Union had just collapsed. Institutions were in disarray. The last thing anyone wanted was an international incident over a leaked nerve agent in a tourist area. So, the theory goes, the official report was sanitized. Hypothermia and heart attack. Clean. Simple. Nothing to see here. But there are problems with this theory too. The most obvious one is Valentina. If the group was exposed to a lethal dose of a nerve agent, why did she survive? She was with them, she was breathing the same air, she was on the same slope. Yes, she ran, and yes, she was farther from the initial collapse, but nerve agents don't respect distance that precisely. If the concentration was high enough to take down 6 people in minutes, it should have affected her too. Unless, and this is where the theory gets more speculative, the exposure was highly localized. Maybe they walked through a pocket of contaminated air, a low-lying plume that Valentina, being slightly ahead or upwind, managed to avoid. Or maybe the dose wasn't uniform and she received a sublethal amount that left her sick but not incapacitated. It's possible, but it requires a lot of maybes and what-ifs to hold together. And there's another issue. If this was a known contaminated zone, why were there no warnings? Why were tourist groups allowed to hike through it? The Khamar Daban range was, and still is, a popular area for outdoor recreation. If there had been a history of mysterious illnesses or sudden losses in that region, someone would have noticed. Someone would have said something. And as far as we know, no other groups have reported similar incidents before or since. That doesn't rule out the chemical theory entirely. A single, isolated release could have occurred, a wind pattern that only existed for a few hours on that particular day, but it makes it harder to prove. The third theory is more medical than sinister, though no less disturbing. It suggests that what ended these hikers was not an external toxin but an internal catastrophe, a sudden, overwhelming failure of the lungs and cardiovascular system triggered by a perfect storm of environmental and physiological factors. The official term for this is acute pulmonary edema, and in its most severe forms, it can be just as rapid and just as deadly as any poison. Here's how it works. Under certain conditions, high altitude, extreme exertion, cold, pre-existing respiratory infection, the delicate membranes in the lungs can start to leak. Fluid seeps out of the blood vessels and into the air sacs, the tiny spaces where oxygen is supposed to be exchanged. As those spaces fill with fluid, breathing becomes harder. Oxygenation drops. The heart, struggling to compensate, starts to fail. Foam appears at the mouth, pink and frothy, as the lungs effectively drown from the inside. The brain, starved of oxygen, begins to malfunction. Confusion sets in, panic, hallucinations. In extreme cases, violent, uncontrolled behavior as the dying person's higher cognitive functions shut down and only raw animal terror remains. This is called high-altitude pulmonary edema, or HAPE, and while it's most commonly associated with climbers at extreme elevations, above 3,000 meters, it has been documented at lower altitudes in susceptible individuals, especially when other risk factors are present. The Khamar Daban group was at around 2,400 meters, not incredibly high but high enough. They were exerting themselves, they were cold, they were wet. If any of them had been fighting off a respiratory infection in the days before, something as simple as a cold or a mild flu, it could have primed their lungs for disaster. And here's the key. If one person starts to go into pulmonary edema and the others panic and start running, their heart rates spike, their breathing becomes ragged, and they push their bodies into the exact physiological state that makes edema more likely. It becomes a feedback loop. One collapse triggers panic, panic triggers exertion, exertion triggers more collapses. Within minutes, you have a cluster of victims, all experiencing the same cascade of respiratory and cardiovascular failure. The autopsy findings support this. Bruised lungs, fluid in the chest cavity, evidence of severe respiratory distress. These are textbook signs of pulmonary edema, and the bleeding that Valentina described could be explained as well, not literal hemorrhaging from the eyes and ears, but blood-tinged fluid and foam mixing with mucus and tears, streaking across faces and hair, creating the appearance of bleeding in the chaos of the moment. But again, there are gaps. High-altitude pulmonary edema, even in its most aggressive forms, is not usually this synchronous. One person might succumb, maybe two, but 6, nearly simultaneously. That's extraordinarily rare. And the violent motor behavior, Tatiana beating her head against the rocks, fits less comfortably into a pure medical model. Yes, hypoxia can cause confusion and irrational actions, but self-injury at that level suggests something more than just oxygen deprivation. It suggests agony. It suggests desperation to escape something unbearable. So we're left with a fourth possibility, one that's harder to define because it's not a single explanation, but a synthesis of several. Maybe the truth of what happened on Khamar Daban isn't one thing but a combination. A primary insult followed by a cascade of secondary effects, all amplified by the environment and the panic of the moment. Perhaps the group was exposed to something, a chemical, a gas, a biological agent, we don't know, that triggered acute pulmonary and neurological distress in several members. Then, as they began to collapse, the others panicked. They ran. The exertion, the cold, the altitude, the sheer terror of watching their friends perish in front of them, all of it pushed their already stressed bodies over the edge. What began as a localized toxic event became a mass casualty incident, not because everyone was exposed equally, but because the environment itself became a weapon. In this model, the official report isn't entirely wrong. Hypothermia and cardiovascular failure did contribute to the ending of these hikers, but they were the second hit, not the first. And the first hit, the thing that set everything in motion, was quietly smoothed over, either because the investigators didn't understand it, didn't have the tools to identify it, or didn't want to open a line of inquiry that would lead to uncomfortable places. This kind of institutional smoothing is not uncommon in cases like this. When something happens that doesn't fit neatly into established categories, when the evidence is ambiguous and the political implications are murky, the easiest solution is to default to the simplest explanation and close the file. It's not necessarily a cover-up in the conspiratorial sense, but it's a form of bureaucratic self-preservation. Complex investigations take time, resources, and political will. In the Russia of 1993, none of those things were in abundance. The victims were from Kazakhstan. The incident occurred in a remote part of Buryatia, and the media pressure was minimal. So the case was wrapped up, labeled and filed away. But Valentina Utochenko never filed it away. In the years since, she has given multiple interviews, each time reiterating what she saw, what she experienced, and her unwavering belief that the official explanation is insufficient. In 2018, more than 2 decades after the incident, she spoke again with Komsomolskaya Pravda, one of Russia's largest newspapers. Her account remained consistent in its core details: the sudden onset, the speed, the violence, the blood, the foam. She described how Lyudmila Korovina, the experienced leader who was supposed to keep them all safe, collapsed on top of Alexander Krysin and never moved again. She described how Tatiana clawed at her own throat, how the boys ran and fell and lay still on the slope. And she described the 4 days she spent alone, walking through the wilderness with the images of her friends' final moments burned into her mind. She also pushed back hard against the suggestion that Lyudmila had mismanaged the trip or starved the group. Yes, the report mentioned malnutrition, but Valentina insisted they had adequate food, that they were not weakened or neglected. Lyudmila, she said, was a professional. She made the best decisions she could with the information she had. What happened to them was not the result of negligence. It was the result of something they could not have anticipated or prepared for, something that had no name. Before we go further, I want to ask you something. If you've made it this far into this story, if you're still here, listening, questioning, feeling that pull of the unknown, share this with someone. Send it to a friend who loves mysteries, or post it somewhere that others might find it. The Midnight File exists because of listeners like you, people who refuse to let these stories fade. And every share, every conversation it starts, keeps the memory of these hikers alive. The Khamar Daban incident is often compared to another famous Russian hiking tragedy, the Dyatlov Pass incident of 1959. In that case, 9 experienced hikers perished in the Ural Mountains under circumstances that have puzzled investigators for over 6 decades. The Dyatlov group's tent was found torn open from the inside, their bodies scattered across the snow, some with bizarre injuries including fractured skulls and missing eyes, others with unexplained levels of radiation. For years, theories ranged from avalanches to secret military tests to infrasound-induced panic. In 2019, after renewed investigation, Russian authorities officially attributed the Dyatlov incident to a specific type of avalanche, combined with panic and poor decision-making. But even that conclusion is contested by some researchers who point to details that don't quite fit. The parallels to Khamar Daban are obvious. Both involved skilled groups in remote winter-like conditions. Both featured sudden, catastrophic outcomes that defied simple explanation. Both were officially closed, with narratives that many found unsatisfying. And both have become focal points for a particular kind of investigative work, one that tries to reconstruct not just what happened, but how institutions shape the stories we're allowed to tell about what happened. Donny Eichar, in his book on the Dyatlov Pass incident, pioneered a method of deep research that combines timeline reconstruction, weather modeling, human psychology, and forensic analysis to build a more complete picture than any single official report could provide. Some writers have tried to apply that same approach to Khamar Daban, sifting through survivor testimony, regional news reports, and the sparse autopsy summaries that are available. But the challenges are greater. Dyatlov, despite its mysteries, has a wealth of primary documentation: diaries, photographs, investigative files. Khamar Daban has one eyewitness, a handful of second-hand reports, and a medical conclusion that raises more questions than it answers. What we're left with is not a solved mystery, but a documented void, a place where something happened that we cannot fully explain with the tools and frameworks we have. And that, in many ways, is more unsettling than any single answer could be. Because it means the mountains still hold their secret. It means that somewhere in the Khamar Daban range, on a grassy slope above the tree line, the truth is still waiting. Let me take you back one more time to that ridge, to those final minutes. Picture it: 7 people moving down a wet, rocky slope in the early morning light. The storm has passed, but the wind is still fierce, cutting through their damp clothing. They're tired, cold, ready to be off the mountain. And then Alexander at the back stumbles. Maybe he feels it first: a tightness in his chest, a strange taste in his mouth, a sudden inability to draw a full breath. He calls out. The others turn. And in that moment, whatever mechanism has been set in motion, chemical, medical, environmental, reaches its crescendo. Foam pours from his mouth as his lungs flood. His muscles lock in spasm. Blood vessels in his eyes and ears rupture under the strain. Lyudmila runs to him, her instincts as a leader overriding any sense of personal danger. But she's already been exposed, already inhaled the same air, already crossed the same invisible threshold. She collapses onto him and they go down together. Tatiana, horror-struck, rushes forward and is hit by the same wave. Her throat closes. She can't breathe. She can't think. The only thing her oxygen-starved brain can process is pain, and in a desperate, futile attempt to escape it, she tries to beat it out of herself against the rocks. Dennis, Timur, and Victor break and run. It's not cowardice, it's survival instinct. But running makes it worse. Their hearts pound, their breathing becomes ragged. The exertion floods their already compromised lungs with more fluid, accelerates the cascade. One by one they fall. And Valentina, just far enough away, just lucky enough, is spared. She watches it all happen. She watches her friends perish in front of her. And then she runs too, not toward them but away, because there's nothing she can do, nothing anyone could do. She survives. But survival comes at a cost. For 4 days, she walks alone through one of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth. She takes food from the bodies of people she cared about. She follows power lines and rivers, driven by nothing more than the stubborn refusal to let whatever took them take her too. When the kayakers find her, she's barely human, a shell of a girl, covered in dirt and blood. Her eyes empty. She tells her story, she tells it again, and no one believes her. Not fully, not in the way she needs them to. The official report comes out. Hypothermia, heart attack, malnutrition, case closed. But Valentina knows. She knows that what she saw was not the slow surrender of cold. It was fast, it was violent, it was wrong. And for the rest of her life, she carries that knowledge along with the question that can never be answered: why was she spared? There's a phenomenon in disaster psychology called survivor's guilt, and it's particularly acute in cases where the survival seems arbitrary. Why her and not them? Was it just luck? Was it positioning? Was it something in her physiology? Some quirk of genetics or immune response that made her resistant to whatever took the others? Or was it simply that she was far enough away when the invisible line was crossed, and by the time the danger reached her, it had dissipated just enough? We don't know. She doesn't know. And not knowing is its own kind of torment. In the years since 1993, the Khamar Daban incident has faded from public consciousness in the way most tragedies do. There was a brief flurry of regional news coverage, some local interest, a few articles in Russian-language newspapers. But without new evidence, without a dramatic turn in the investigation, the story lost momentum. The families of the lost hikers mourned. Valentina tried to rebuild her life. And the mountains, indifferent as always, continued to draw hikers and adventurers to their slopes. But the questions persist. They persist because they matter, not just as a puzzle to be solved, but as a reminder of how fragile our understanding of the world really is. We like to think we've mapped everything, explained everything, brought the whole planet under the dominion of human knowledge. But we haven't. There are still places where the rules break down, where the ordinary becomes incomprehensible, where people can walk into a landscape and simply cease to be in ways that defy all our models and frameworks. The Khamar Daban incident is one of those places. It's a crack in the facade of certainty, a case study in the limits of forensic science and institutional investigation. And it's a story that refuses to end, because the central question, what happened on that ridge, remains unanswered. So let's talk about what we do know, what we can say with confidence, even if it's not much. We know that 6 people experienced acute, catastrophic physiological collapse within a very short time frame. We know that all of them showed signs of severe pulmonary damage. We know that the environmental conditions were harsh, cold, wet, high altitude, exposed, but not outside the realm of what experienced hikers regularly encounter and survive. We know that the sole survivor described symptoms that do not match typical hypothermia progression. We know that the official investigation concluded quickly with explanations that many found inadequate. And we know that no similar incident has been reported in that area before or since, which is both reassuring and deeply puzzling. What we don't know is the mechanism. We don't know what specific insult, chemical, medical, environmental, or some combination, triggered the cascade. We don't know if it was preventable, if there was a moment when different choices could have led to different outcomes. We don't know if the authorities had information they chose not to share, or if they were simply working with incomplete data and made the best conclusions they could. We don't know if Valentina Utachenko's survival was pure chance, or if there was something that protected her. And we don't know if the truth is something we could even recognize if we found it. That uncertainty is uncomfortable. It gnaws at us. We want resolution. We want the pieces to fit. We want to be able to point to a single cause and say, that's what happened. But real life doesn't always provide that comfort. Sometimes, despite our best efforts, despite forensic pathology and investigative rigor and decades of analysis, the truth remains just out of reach. Sometimes the mountains keep their secrets. But here's what I can tell you. Those 6 hikers, Alexander Krysin, Denis Shvachkin, Timur Bapanov, Viktor Zalesova, Tatiana Filipenko, and Lyudmila Korovina, deserve to be remembered as more than a mystery. They were real people with families and dreams and futures that were stolen from them on a cold ridge in Siberia. They went into the mountains seeking adventure, seeking beauty, seeking the kind of experience that makes you feel alive. And something happened that took all of that away in the span of minutes. Valentina Utachenko deserves to be believed, not blindly, not without scrutiny, but with the recognition that she witnessed something traumatic, something that her mind has struggled to process for over 30 years, and that her insistence on the violence and speed of what occurred is not attention-seeking or fabrication, but the testimony of someone who saw the incomprehensible and has tried, in her own way, to make it comprehensible for the rest of us. And we, as people who hear these stories, who investigate these cases, who refuse to let them fade into obscurity, we have a responsibility to keep asking questions, not because we're entitled to answers, but because the act of questioning is itself a form of respect. It says that these lives mattered, that their ending matters, that the truth, wherever it is, whatever it is worth pursuing. If this story has stayed with you, if you felt the weight of those unanswered questions, then do me a favor. Leave a comment below, tell me what you think happened, share your theories, your doubts, your instincts. The comment section is where this community comes alive, where we think through these mysteries together. And who knows, maybe someone reading this knows something, has a piece of information that hasn't been connected yet. These cases aren't solved in isolation. They're solved when enough people care enough to keep pushing. In the months and years after the incident, search leader Yuri Golius publicly placed blame on Lyudmila Korovina, accusing her of poor judgment in camping high, of failing to feed her group adequately, of making decisions that put them in unnecessary danger. It's a familiar pattern in Russian disaster investigations. Find a human failure, pin the tragedy to it, and move on. It's tidier that way. It requires less systemic examination, but it's also deeply unfair. Lyudmila Korovina was, by all accounts, an exceptionally skilled mountaineer and instructor. She had led countless expeditions without incident. She held credentials that most recreational hikers will never achieve. To suggest that she simply made a rookie mistake that cost 6 lives is to ignore the larger question. If an experienced master of sports can lead a well-prepared group into a situation that ends in synchronized catastrophic collapse, then what does that say about the nature of the danger they faced? It says, I think, that whatever took those hikers was not something that could have been avoided through better planning or more conservative decision-making. It was something aberrant, something that existed outside the normal risk profile of mountain travel. And that's what makes it so frightening. Because we can prepare for avalanches, we can prepare for weather, we can prepare for equipment failure and human error and all the predictable dangers that come with venturing into wild places. But how do you prepare for something you don't know exists? You can't. Let me tell you about the place where they were found. The Khamar Daban Mountains are part of a larger range system that extends for hundreds of kilometers south of Lake Baikal. The terrain is rugged, heavily forested at lower elevations, giving way to alpine meadows and exposed ridgelines higher up. The weather is notoriously fickle. Lake Baikal, the deepest freshwater lake in the world, creates its own microclimate, pulling moisture and cold air from the surrounding steppes and funneling it up into the mountains. A sunny morning can turn into a whiteout by afternoon. Summer temperatures can plunge to near freezing at night, especially above 2,000 meters. The Buryat people, who have lived in this region for centuries, have dozens of stories about the mountains, about spirits and disappearances and places where the rules of the ordinary world don't quite apply. Whether you take those stories literally or as metaphorical warnings about the unpredictability of the landscape, they all carry the same message: respect the mountains because they do not respect you. The grassy slope where the bodies were found is not particularly distinctive. There's no dramatic cliff face, no hidden crevasse, no obvious geological feature that would suggest danger. It's just a hillside, steep enough to be tiring to climb, but not technically difficult, covered in low vegetation and scattered rocks. In good weather, you could walk past it without a second thought. But in a storm, with the wind howling and the visibility down to a few meters, it becomes a different place entirely. Disorientation sets in quickly. Cold penetrates even good gear. Decision-making becomes impaired. And if something else is happening, if there's an additional stressor, a hidden variable, then that unremarkable slope can become a killing ground. The tree line in the Khamar Daban range sits at around 2,100 to 2,200 meters. Above that, you're exposed. The group was camped just above it, and they encountered whatever happened to them while descending, still above the relative safety of the forest. If they had been 100 meters lower, would they have survived? If the camp had been positioned differently, if the timing had been shifted even slightly, would the outcome have changed? These are the kinds of questions that haunt retrospective analysis. We can map the what and the where, but the why remains elusive. And here's another layer to consider: the delay. Remember, Valentina reached help on the 9th or 10th of August. The search didn't launch until the 24th. That's 2 weeks. 2 weeks during which the bodies lay on that exposed slope, subjected to wind, rain, sun, and the inevitable processes of decomposition. 2 weeks during which any trace evidence that might have been present, residues, chemical signatures, biological markers, could have degraded or been washed away. 2 weeks during which scavengers, though they apparently left the bodies largely untouched, could have disturbed the scene. By the time forensic pathologists examined the remains, what they were looking at was not the moment of ending, but a heavily altered version of it. The autopsies, thorough as they may have been, were working with compromised material, and the conclusions they reached, hypothermia, heart failure, pulmonary edema, while medically plausible, are also the conclusions you'd expect when definitive cause of passing cannot be determined, and the available evidence points in multiple directions. This is not to suggest a conspiracy or intentional obfuscation, but simply to acknowledge a hard truth. Sometimes, the forensic tools we have are not sufficient to answer the questions we're asking. Sometimes, by the time we get to the scene, too much has been lost. There's a concept in emergency medicine called the golden hour, the first 60 minutes after a traumatic event, when intervention can make the difference between life and loss. In forensic science, there's a similar principle. The sooner you can secure and analyze evidence, the more likely you are to extract meaningful information from it. The Khamar Daban investigation had neither a golden hour nor a golden day. It had 2 weeks of degradation before anyone even arrived, and that's not the fault of the investigators or the search teams. It's a function of geography, resources, and the chaotic state of Russian institutions in the early 90s. But it matters. It matters a great deal when we're trying to understand what happened. So where does that leave us? We have a survivor who describes a rapid, violent event. We have autopsy findings that confirm severe lung damage, but attribute the ending to hypothermia and heart failure. We have a location known for harsh conditions, but not for mass casualties. We have theories ranging from environmental to chemical to medical, none of them fully satisfactory. And we have families who lost their loved ones without ever getting a clear explanation of why. In the absence of definitive answers, what we're left with is narrative, stories we tell ourselves to make sense of senseless things. And maybe that's okay. Maybe the value of cases like Khamar Daban isn't in solving them, but in grappling with them, in sitting with the discomfort of not knowing, and in recognizing that the universe is still capable of surprising us, still capable of presenting phenomena that don't fit neatly into our categories and frameworks. I've spent a lot of time on this case. I've read the survivor interviews, studied the geographical and meteorological data, consulted with people who understand high-altitude medicine and toxicology, and the conclusion I keep coming back to is this. Something happened on that ridge that we don't have a name for. Maybe it was a perfect storm of factors: altitude, cold, exertion, panic, and an underlying medical vulnerability that no one knew was there. Maybe it was exposure to a substance that has since dispersed and will never be identified. Maybe it was a freak microclimate event, a pocket of low oxygen or high carbon dioxide that formed in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something we haven't even conceived of yet, because our understanding of environmental physiology and toxicology is still incomplete. What I do know is that the people who lost their lives deserve more than a footnote in a forgotten case file. They deserve our attention, our curiosity, and our respect. And Valentina Utochenko, who has had to live with the memory of that day for over 30 years, deserves to be heard. Before we close, I want to circle back to something I said earlier. I mentioned survivor's guilt, that psychological burden that comes from being the one who made it out when others didn't. But there's another dimension to Valentina's experience that we should consider: survivor's knowledge. She's the only person who saw what happened. She's the only witness. And for decades, she's been telling the same story with the same core details, only to have it dismissed or explained away. That's a profound form of isolation. It's one thing to survive a traumatic event. It's another thing entirely to survive it and then be told implicitly or explicitly that your memory of it is unreliable, exaggerated, or flat out wrong. I don't think Valentina's memory is wrong. I think it's incomplete, as all human memory is, especially memory formed under extreme stress. I think there are details she's filled in over time, consciously or unconsciously, as her mind tried to make sense of the chaos. But I also think the broad strokes, the speed, the violence, the symptoms, are accurate. Because those are the things that don't make sense, and if she were inventing or embellishing, she would have gravitated toward an explanation that fit better with what we know about mountain accidents. She didn't. She stuck with the incomprehensible, and that, to me, lends her account a certain credibility. The human mind, when confronted with trauma, sometimes retreats into narrative simplification. We smooth over the rough edges, make the story more coherent, more bearable. But Valentina's story has remained stubbornly incoherent, stubbornly disturbing. And I think that's because what she saw was genuinely disturbing, genuinely beyond her frame of reference, and no amount of time or retelling has made it fit into a comfortable shape. Now, let's talk about what we can learn from this, because that's ultimately why we examine these cases. Not just to satisfy morbid curiosity or to indulge in mystery solving, but to extract lessons that might save lives in the future. If the Khamar Daban incident was caused by a rare medical event, acute pulmonary edema triggered by a specific constellation of factors, then mountaineers and hiking guides need to be aware of that possibility, need to know the warning signs, need to have protocols in place for rapid descent and evacuation if someone starts showing symptoms. If it was caused by chemical exposure, then environmental monitoring in regions with a history of industrial or military activity becomes a safety imperative. And if it was something else, something we haven't identified, then the lesson is humility, a reminder that we don't know everything, that nature and chemistry and human physiology can still surprise us in lethal ways. But there's also a broader lesson here about how we handle investigations, how we document and preserve evidence, and how we communicate uncertainty. The Khamar Daban case was closed too quickly, with explanations that didn't fully account for the observed phenomena. Whether that was due to resource limitations, institutional pressure, or simple human error, the result is the same. We're left without answers, and that serves no one. Not the families, not the survivor, not the scientific community, not future hikers who might encounter similar conditions. A more thorough investigation, one that acknowledged the gaps in our understanding rather than papering over them with convenient diagnoses, would have been far more valuable. It might not have provided closure, but it would have provided clarity about what we know and what we don't. Transparency in the face of uncertainty is not a weakness, it's a strength. It's what allows knowledge to accumulate over time, as new evidence and new analytical techniques become available. By officially closing the case with a simple explanation, the Russian authorities foreclosed future inquiry. They signaled that there was nothing more to learn, nothing more to investigate, and that's a tragedy in its own right. I want to read you something. This is from one of Valentina's later interviews, translated from Russian. She's talking about the moment she realized she was the only one left alive. I looked back and they were all just lying there, not sleeping, not resting, gone. And I thought, why? Why them and not me? What did I do differently? What did I miss? And I still don't know. I don't think I'll ever know. That's the voice of someone who has spent a lifetime trying to answer an unanswerable question. And maybe that's the real legacy of the Khamar Daban incident. Not a solved mystery, but a reminder that some questions resist answers, and that we have to find a way to live with that. If you've made it to the end of this investigation with me, thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about these 6 people and the one who survived. If you found this valuable, if it made you think, hit that like button. It helps more people find these stories, and if you haven't already, subscribe. Because there are so many more cases like this, so many more files waiting to be opened, so many more stories that need to be told. The world is full of mysteries, some we solve, some we don't. But all of them are worth examining, worth preserving, worth passing down to the next generation of investigators and storytellers. Because every case, solved or unsolved, teaches us something about the world we live in and the fragility of human life within it. Now let me bring us to a close. It's late. The kind of late where the world feels quieter, where the boundaries between what we know and what we fear start to blur. And I can't help but think about that ridge in the Khamar Daban mountains, thousands of miles away, where grass grows over the spot where 6 people fell. I wonder if hikers still pass through there, if they know what happened, if they feel anything when they cross that threshold, or if the mountains have absorbed the memory, folded it into the countless other stories of loss and survival that have played out across their slopes over millennia. I think about Valentina, too. I hope she's found some measure of peace. I hope that speaking about what happened, telling her story again and again, has provided some release, some sense that she's honored the memory of her friends, by refusing to let their ending be sanitized or forgotten. I hope she knows that there are people out there, people she'll never meet, who hear her, who believe her, and who carry a small piece of that burden with her. Because that's what stories do. They distribute weight. They turn private trauma into shared knowledge. They transform individual grief into collective memory. And in doing so, they ensure that the people we've lost continue to exist in some form, continue to matter, continue to be more than just names in a file. Alexander Krizin, Denis Shvachkin, Timur Bapanov, Viktor Zalesova, Tatiana Filipenko, Lyudmila Korovina. Say their names. Remember them. Not as mysteries, not as victims of some inexplicable force, but as people. Young people with futures that were cut short, with families who loved them, with dreams that will never be realized. They went into the mountains seeking adventure and found something else entirely, something that none of us fully understand, something that the mountains have not explained and may never explain. And Valentina Utochenko, survivor, witness, the keeper of a truth that the world has struggled to accept. She walked out of those mountains alone, carrying the weight of 6 losses and the burden of a story no one wanted to hear. She has lived with that for over 30 years, and she has never stopped insisting that what happened on that ridge was not simple, was not ordinary, and was not the clean, tidy ending that the official reports claimed. If there's a final thought I want to leave you with, it's this. The world is stranger and more dangerous than we like to admit. We build our lives on assumptions of predictability, on the belief that if we follow the rules, take the right precautions and make good decisions, we'll be safe. And most of the time that's true, but not always. Sometimes, despite everything, the rules break down. Sometimes the ordinary becomes extraordinary in the worst possible way. And when that happens, all we can do is bear witness, document what we can, and hope that somewhere in the fragments of evidence and testimony, there's a lesson that will protect the next group, the next adventurer, the next person who walks into the wilderness with trust and hope. The Khamar Daban incident is a crack in that comfortable worldview. It's a reminder that we are still, in some fundamental sense, at the mercy of forces we don't fully control or understand. And that's terrifying. But it's also, in a strange way, awe-inspiring, because it means there's still mystery in the world. There are still questions worth asking. There are still stories that resist neat conclusions and demand that we sit with uncertainty, with ambiguity, with the humbling recognition that we don't have all the answers. So the file remains open, not officially perhaps, not in the archives of the Russian Procuracy or the dusty cabinets of the Ulan-Ude forensic lab, but here in conversations like this one, in the minds of people who refuse to let these cases be forgotten, the investigation continues. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the act of remembering, of questioning, of refusing to accept the simplest explanation when it doesn't fit the facts. Maybe that's its own form of justice. The mountains are still there. The ridge where they fell is still there, unchanged by time, indifferent to human tragedy. And somewhere in those mountains, in the wind and the rock and the thin air at altitude, the truth is still waiting. Whether we ever find it or not, it's there, immutable, patient, silent. Thank you for walking this path with me tonight. Thank you for listening to a story that has no easy ending, no satisfying resolution, no moment where all the pieces click into place and we can say, yes, that's what happened. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is admit we don't know. And sometimes the most important thing we can do is make sure that the people who are gone are not forgotten. This has been the Midnight File. I'm Julian Cross. And until the next case finds us, remember, the world keeps secrets. But so do we. And every story we preserve, every question we keep asking, every life we refuse to reduce to a statistic, that's how we push back against the silence. Stay curious, stay questioning. And if the darkness feels a little closer tonight, a little more real, don't worry. That just means you're paying attention. Good night.